This is Dane Wigington with Geoengineeringwatch.org with an update report on the global contamination that is occurring due to ongoing and accelerating climate intervention operations known as solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection. This is the aircraft dispersed elements in our skies that Geoengineeringwatch.org has tried so desperately to disclose for the last decade and a half. On this exchange with me will be a PhD scientist from an internationally recognized agricultural research and testing institution. For the purposes of this exchange, we will call him Joe. That is not his real name. We need to keep him off the radar for now. But we have very specific data to go over, including numerous testing results from precipitation, calculations of how much material is being dropped over a specific state in the U.S., which I'm not going to name, again, for purposes of anonymity for the testing institution involved. But with that calculation, we can determine roughly what the global dispersion of materials is, and the figures are absolutely staggering. The amount of materials that, based on calculations, appear to be being dispersed annually over the planet itself is unimaginable. And there is a correlation with what the world's most recognized climate engineers have stated on the record as their intended goal of spraying these light-scattering particles into our sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. On the phone with me now, again, this is a PhD scientist, researcher, major globally recognized agricultural research institution. And we are going to call him Joe for the purposes of this exchange. Joe, are you with us?
Hi, Dane. Yes, it's a pleasure talking to you, as always.
It's a great honor and asset to have you assisting Geoengineeringwatch.org with this data. And we've been working together for a number of years now, I believe about 4 years, maybe 5, and covered a lot of ground over the course of that time. We know that the amount of material that we're breathing, fine particulate matter in the nanoparticle range, which no major air quality testing institution measures for. They don't even look for it. So all of it goes under the radar, and the amount of this material is, again, inconceivably massive. It's the most toxic. The smaller the particles are, the most toxic they are to respiratory systems. And Joe, this also affects these particles, given their composition, their synergistic toxicity. We know they have an immense impact on the soil microbiome, root systems, plant growth. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, Dane, those particulates, they affect everything, right? Because of their size and the way they interact with particles. When you come to the nanoscale, they become very reactive and they can do things that larger particles cannot do. And you're right, the EPA, they stopped measuring anything that is below 2 microns. Their limit is 2 microns. And what we have done, we have gone way below that for the purpose of the testing. A lot of the testing that we did throughout the Midwest in the United States. We focused on 0.45 microns, which is about 450 nanometers, and smaller particles. And we collected range samples from several different locations in the Midwest, and there were over 500 samples in a year that were collected. And what we did, we tested for several elements. We tested for aluminum, we tested for barium, we tested for strontium, and a few other things that were of interest. And like we talked about this, based on these calculations, right, we are in a very specific region on the planet, but if we extrapolate it out from where we are into the entire planet, based on the samples that we collected, we find that almost 15 million tons of aluminum, barium, and strontium combined is being spread yearly on the land masses. But now if we take on the entire planet, because I believe that geoengineering strategies, they will not be focused on land masses because that would really limit what they think they are doing. I'm thinking that this is spread over the entire planet, and that brings us to over 40 million tons of those three particular elements being spread on the entire planet. And this has then catastrophic consequences. As you know, soils in California, as we have reported, the aluminum concentration and pH has increased dramatically. When you use aluminum oxide as when you spread aluminum oxide into soils that are more acidic, like agricultural soils are, what happens is what that aluminum will do, it will tend to increase the pH because the oxide is going to react with the acidity in the soil, and that's going to drive the pH high. Now, what also happens is, once that happens, the aluminum becomes a little bit soluble, and then if there's plants growing there, that can significantly impact plant growth, and plants can also uptake some of that aluminum. Though the aluminum has very high toxicity, and I don't think the amount that they are spraying would kill the plant right away, but you accumulate in the soil, and it may accumulate in tissue, especially on the leaves, as that stuff falls from the sky and hits the plants. That will stick to the plants. And again, it's all in a nanoscale. It could migrate into the tissue of plants and also into the edible part of plants that are growing when the stuff is falling. So a lot of scientists will say the aluminum will not get into the plant except for what the plant will tolerate from the root. But we're not talking about root uptake here. We're talking about the entire plant being covered with aluminum nanoparticles, and that can transfer into the tissue of the plant, can get inside of the plant, and who knows where that transferred to afterwards. Because we're not testing, right? As you said. Go ahead.
Well, I want to make a point, too. With larger organisms like trees in forests, we do have peer-reviewed science study to say that when they detect this aluminum toxicity in precipitation and soils, bioavailable aluminum now, that those larger organisms can tend to shut down nutrient uptake, correct, to try to protect themselves from this toxin, causing a slow, protracted death of the trees in the forest. So the smaller organisms, edible crops, so forth, may be uptaking this, which means we are intaking it with consumption of these organisms. But in larger organisms like trees, it can also tend to, again, shut down nutrient uptake, causing slow, protracted death, correct?
That's correct, Dane, and that's the main defense mechanism of the plant, is to shut down nutrient uptake in the presence of high concentration of aluminum. And by high, it doesn't have to be excessive. Whatever passes the threshold of the plant, it's considered over the tolerance, and then the plant will stop nutrient uptake. And one thing that we can kind of correlate here, Dane, is that we know that right now, whenever we buy food from the store, the nutrient load is much lower than what it used to be. A lot of this is blamed on the use of chemical fertilizers, but I think it could also be related to the high amount of aluminum being spread, which is forcing plants to shut down nutrient uptake and therefore have a lower nutrient density overall, which, like I think you have touched on this on some of your broadcasts, that we have to consume a lot more food now to get the same amount of nutrition than we used to. And some of this is due to chemical fertilizer use, but I believe it could also be linked to aluminum toxicity and plants being less efficient at removing nutrients from soil. The microorganisms in the soil, they're also negatively impacted because, as you mentioned, this aluminum is now bioavailable. And if the plants suffer from it, so will the microbial community in the soil. That can limit what type of microbes can go in the soil, can limit the type of community of microbes that are growing, and it can limit the function of the soil. And therefore, it becomes a much less effective media for plants to grow and for nutrients to be made available for that crop. And then we, on the other hand, we are eating less nutritious plants. Even things like cattle. Whoever eats meat, you're eating a meat in the cattle that is less nutritious as well, because they are in plants and corn and soybean, whatever they're being fed, which have a lower nutrient density, and therefore they will also have a lower nutrient density. And then on the overall, we all end up with nutrient deficiencies, lower health, and a cascade of negative consequences as a result of this single thing, right? That is just the senseless application of aluminum on the stratosphere.
A cascading effect. And on top of everything that we've just discussed, we have the fact that the genetically modified crops, genetically modified organisms in and of themselves, although they grow significantly faster, they contain in many cases half the nutrition. And that's on top of all the other nutrient limiting factors we've already discussed. So it's truly a very negative scenario here all the way around for anything living to gain the essential nutrients needed to sustain optimal health, correct?
That's correct, Dane. And the GMO brings out another issue. But before you go there, let me just make one more point about those nanoparticles being spread. Here we're only talking about aluminum, but barium and strontium, they could also have very negative consequences, but we don't know, right? We're not looking for, we're not measuring, because as far as government institutions are concerned, it's not an issue because it doesn't exist. But here we have over 10 million tons, 40 million tons on the entire planet of those three particles being spread, and we are not even looking for them. So how could we know whether or not they are really negatively impacting our lives? It says that it's very significantly negative.
Absolutely true, and very important points. And then we have also synergistic toxicity, that all these elements highly toxic in and of themselves, and when combined, toxicity can increase exponentially, correct? We have in the case of aluminum and mercury, we have peer-reviewed study of the synergistic toxicity between those two metals, both of which are now ubiquitous in the environment and in us. And the toxicity increase based on peer-reviewed study between those two metals can be as much as 100 times worse, 10,000% worse. And we have also, for those that don't know, have long since had Monsanto, for example, engineering aluminum-resistant crops. Why? And I think the why is clear now. I mean, all these entities working together behind the scenes, the climate engineering operations, and their dispersal of literally so many millions of tons, staggering numbers, dozens of millions of tons annually based on the calculations that you've done. And so they've tried to mask the effect by engineering aluminum-resistant seeds, correct?
That's true, Dane, and that's a great point as well. And it's important to say this because when you talk about aluminum, a lot of people, especially those that are in the agriculture field, they'll say, well, I don't see any of this limited growth or limited yield, so I don't really think that this is reasonable. But that's what happened. They have engineered crops that are more tolerant to those elements, especially aluminum, so that the plant will not, you'll not see a reduction, but you will see a decrease in nutrient density as well. That does happen, right. And we know now that the foods are less dense, and that's probably why, because you cannot have a crop growing in such a high aluminum concentration in the soil and expect the plant to be as if it was growing under normal conditions, right?
Correct. And to give listeners an idea, I want to back up. You mentioned that you've done on an annual basis over a specific region in the Midwest about 500 tests, and I know there was about 100 done recently. And we also had the element graphene show up in most of those tests, correct?
Yes, graphene is like you had speculated that graphene was also being used for geoengineering operations, and we are able to confirm that indeed there are, not in all events, not in all rainfall or snowfall, but in the majority of them, there are graphene oxide is showing showing up in the samples that we collected. And that, again, that's in the nanoscale. It's less than 450 nanometer size. Anything above that we did not test, so it could be much more, right? All those numbers we are giving here, it's all on the nanoscale. There could be larger particles that between that 2 micron and 0.45 microns that we did not measure, so that could be even much more than what we are talking about. But yes, graphene is present now. And graphene is very interesting, Dane, because this graphene stuff, I don't even know why they are still working with graphene. They should have stopped graphene when they first discovered. They should put that on the side, because the amount of issues that this is proving to be, it's unbelievable. I don't know if you are aware of this, but, well, it's going to link several different topics here, Dane, and I'm going to try to keep it in a way that is logical and makes sense. But before we get into the graphene, let's talk a little bit about endocrine disruptor elements that are being spread on the environment. I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there were a lot of hypes about atrazine, especially atrazine, changing sex in frogs. And what happened is that atrazine is known for having endocrine disrupting function. It will mess up the hormone system in the organism. And they found this in amphibians, and they saw that it does happen. Now, they only looked at atrazine. Now, I believe that many of the other pesticides being applied also have that very same effect. Now, when you look in the literature review, you will find that you have very contrasting results reported. Some research will show that, yes, it's indeed very negative and does have very high disrupting properties in terms of endocrine system. And then you have other studies that show that it did not show to have any negative impact on the endocrine system of the species that are being studied. Now, if you look closely into those studies, they usually will take organisms that they're studying, they will put in solutions with different concentrations of those compounds, for example, atrazine or Roundup, glyphosate, whatever you want to study. And then they will leave those organisms there for a few hours or maybe a day, at the most a couple days, and then they grow the organism for their full life in very clean water. And then they will say, well, it had a negative impact or have a positive impact. It did not cause any damage. Now, I would like to see what water body only has atrazine or glyphosate in them for a couple hours a day. Ever since those pesticides have been used, I would say that most of the water bodies have those chemicals in them for the entire year, right? It's not something that happens for a day or two. It's there every single day. And that's what those studies miss. They are not putting those microorganisms in the contaminated water for the entire life cycle. They're only doing for a few days, and they're finding those massive negative impacts on them. And then I wonder what would happen.
But all by design,
yes.
though, right? I mean, obviously by design that everything is completely skewed, just like the so-called air quality testing, which tests only for, at best, PM 2.5 microns, generally 10 microns. So all of these nanoparticles, literally tens of millions of tons, if not hundreds of millions of tons, go completely undetected, correct?
That's correct, and it is by design. I cannot see any other way, because you can look at the EPA right now, and they have a report, I think it came out in 2018, that they showed that over 50% of all water bodies, including rivers, streams, lakes, in the United States are polluted with at least one pesticide, or pollutants. So it's unrealistic to think that you can do a trial to test the negative effect or to test whatever effect of a chemical and only expose that organism for a couple of hours to a couple of days, when in reality they're being exposed their entire life. So I don't really understand why scientists really go with, I think I do, is because they are being told that there's no reason to look for those things, so let's just do a study that fits with the answer that we want, and that's what they've been doing.
That's exactly right. And now, this is, I've stressed on our weekly Global Alert News, geoengineeringwatch.org broadcast, I've stressed over and over and over, so-called environmental protection agencies like the EPA are not there to disclose threats to the public. They're there to hide those threats. That's their function. That's their task from those in power. Again, not to disclose threats, but to hide them. I've been told to my face by California EPA representatives that they are told to test for, exactly as you're stating, in this case, they're told to test for combustion particulates only. The rest of the contaminants found in their air samples go out the window. I was told to my face in Sacramento at the Capitol that they don't care if they find radioactive material in those air tests. It's not combustion material. They don't disclose it. They don't look for it. The whole system is designed not to show the greatest threats. And I would argue that's the case across the board. And that's what the public needs to wake up to, that we have the majority of the science community bought, sold, and paid for. They do what they're told by their paymasters in exchange for a paycheck and a pension.